For someone who has chronic dissociation, there's a reduced interoceptive awareness. The nervous system is not used to feeling sensations fully. There is an overwhelming embodiment, right? Without the cognitive filter, the body may be flooded with sensations and emotions. There's safety challenges there. For someone with a history of dissociation, somatic experiences can feel destabilizing, or they don't have the capacity not to continue to move into repressive responses, either during or after the experience. And then there's the potential triggers that arise, right? If the body feels too much, too quickly, it can create a backlash effect, increasing dissociation or triggering that freeze response. That could actually perpetuate the chronic dissociation and the freeze response. And then you've got to come back into the body, which is the most intense healing experiences don't start in your mind. They start in your body. If you've ever felt like talk therapy wasn't enough or wondered why certain emotions seem lodged deep inside of you beyond words or logic, this conversation is for you. Because today we're exploring a powerful territory, peak somatic experiences, including psychedelics, and how they interact with the deepest layers of our nervous system, trauma processing, and healing. Maybe you've done the mindset work, but something still feels stuck. Maybe you've had a breakthrough, a breathwork session that left you trembling or in tears. Maybe you've explored psychedelics, seeking healing, only to find yourself cracked wide open with no tools to make sense of what surfaced. This is a topic that's played a role in our personal journeys, and of course is something I work with extensively, but we've never actually brought it to the podcast before. This is the first time we're really opening up this conversation, and it's going to be a fascinating conversation.
Yes, I'm so excited for this, but I also want to be clear from the start. This is an introductory overview. There are so many nuances to this topic. We're talking about brain chemistry, somatic processing, interoceptive awareness, and what it all means when you have a history of complex trauma. And most importantly, we're going to be talking about why these experiences maybe aren't for everyone. For those of you who've been listening and learning about how complex trauma impacts your nervous system, you'll understand why something can be healing for one person, but it might be overwhelming or maybe even re-traumatizing for someone else.
Exactly. And you might find it very surprising to hear that I don't support the wide use of psychedelic experiences. This is such an important conversation because peak somatic experiences can be life-changing. They can create massive breakthroughs in emotional processing, but they also require careful preparation and integration. And the truth is, some of us are diving into these experiences for healing, and instead, we're left cracked wide open and raw with no real tools to make sense of it all. That's why we wanted to have this conversation, not just to talk about what these experiences are and what they can do for you, but to share our own understanding of how they interact with complex trauma and the nervous system.
Yeah, and before we dive deep in, I want to emphasize, like always, that this is a conversation for informational purposes only. We're not offering medical advice or endorsing or opposing the use of psychedelics or any other type of peak somatic experience. So if you're considering exploring this kind of healing work, please consult a qualified medical or mental health professional, a practitioner that you really trust. Our intention with this episode is to provide an informative discussion and just to shed light on what these experiences can offer while also acknowledging their complexities and the potential risks.
Welcome to Trauma Rewired, the podcast that teaches you about your nervous system, how trauma lives in the body, and what you can do to heal. I'm your co-host, Jennifer Wallace. I'm a neurosomatic psychedelic preparation and integration guide, and I bring your nervous system and its healing into your peak somatic experiences. And by doing so, we create safer spaces for your body to receive the messages and embody the medicine. I'm also one of the educators at the Neurosomatic Intelligence Coaching Certification.
And I'm your co-host, Elizabeth Kristoff, founder of brainbase.com, an online community where we use applied neurology, somatics, and stress processing to expand the capacity of our nervous system for emotional regulation and behavior change. And I'm also the founder of the Neurosomatic Intelligence Coaching Certification, an ICF-accredited course for therapists, practitioners, coaches to bring the nervous system and practical tools to work with the nervous system into all the other modalities of healing that you do.
And I think we should start this conversation with how do we define a peak somatic experience through the lens of NSI? And so that is for us an intense, full-bodied, deeply felt experience where the nervous system and body become highly activated and present. Unlike traditional cognitive or emotional experiences, a peak somatic experience is predominantly felt through the body's sensory and interoceptive system, rather than processing primarily through thoughts or abstract emotions. These experiences can involve heightened sensory awareness, where intensified perception of bodily sensations, temperature, pressure, movement, or vibration could be present. Intense emotional releases, where the body may process emotions physically, resulting in somatic shaking, crying, trembling, or laughter. They could include altered states of consciousness, a sense of being deeply connected to one's body and surroundings, sometimes associated with mystical or transcendental states. Enhanced interoception, which is a deeper awareness of internal body signals like heartbeat, breath, and visceral sensations. Also, breakthroughs in emotional processing, when the body releases held tension or trauma in a way that shifts emotional patterns.
Yeah, and when we're talking about peak somatic experiences, they can include a psychedelic journey where you use a substance like psilocybin or LSD or MDMA to promote increased neuroplasticity or enhance interoceptive awareness, or to help facilitate some of that emotional processing. But there can be other types of peak somatic experience as well. It could be a breathwork practice, such as holotropic breathwork or conscious connected breathing, which can induce powerful somatic and emotional releases. It could be a somatic movement practice, having really deep engagement in a body-based practice that connects you more to your body in that way. Or it could even be trauma release exercises, TRE, which use tremoring to release chronic tension from the body. These are just a few of the type of peak somatic experiences that we're addressing today. And for people with a history of complex trauma or chronic dissociation, peak somatic experiences could be both healing, but it could also be destabilizing, right? Because they can reconnect us to these sensations that have maybe been repressed or deeply buried, and emotions that have been below the surface that can be overwhelming if we don't have the tools for grounding, for regulation, and for integration of those experiences.
And let's talk about what happens during the brain during peak somatic experiences. So I'm going to talk about an overview of how psychedelics work in the brain. I'm first going to define what are psychedelics, because we're going to talk about a particular class of psychedelics today. These are a unique class of drug with potent psychoactive effects, and they don't fit into normal drug classifications like stimulants or depressants or anxiety relievers. They can have reality-shattering effects on perception, emotion, thinking, individuation, and our sense of self, our sense of being. And so when we say we're talking about classic psychedelics, we're talking about serotonergic psychedelics today. LSD, psilocybin, 5-MeO-DMT, and the spirit molecule, right? And mescaline. So how do these work in the brain? Well, we had a really interesting conversation in our integration episode where we talked about neuroplasticity, right? And so this is one of the major reasons that psychedelic healing can be so impactful, is because of the increased neuroplasticity through the 5-HT2A receptor. When we say 5-H2A and serotonin receptor, these are going to be used kind of just interchangeably. So I just kind of want to start there.
Yeah, I think that's important for people to think about, and maybe link back to that integration episode, because we talked about neuroplasticity is neither good nor bad. It just is. So when we're enhancing neuroplasticity, we also want to remember we could be reinforcing a pattern that maybe isn't the direction that we want to go in. So having some practice with emotional processing and repatterning going into these experiences, you can already see when we're talking about this increase in neuroplasticity, why that's important. Because if we're going to have this big boost in neuroplasticity, we want to be able to have the skill to be driving that neuroplasticity in a direction that we want.
That's right. That's right. And so there's a couple areas of the brain. There's actually two major parts of the brain that we want to refer to with this 5-HT2A, where it has the highest amount of occupancy in the brain, and that correlates to the intensity of, say, a psilocybin psychological effect, right? And so your serotonin receptors live in two major parts of the brain. There's the primary visual cortex, and then there's the transmodal association cortex. That overlaps with the default mode network. We hear about the default mode network a lot when it comes to psychedelic therapy. And with these serotonergic psychedelics, there's a dissolution of the default mode network, right? And the default mode network is involved in complex aspects of our behavior and thinking. It's central in our ability to engage in abstract conceptual thought and our ability to imagine the future, remember the past in terms of our narrative that we have, like our biological self. And it's really at the top of the brain's hierarchy.
Yeah, I think you can kind of think of the default mode network as the brain regions that become active when we're not engaged in a goal-directed task, like when we're daydreaming or reflecting or remembering. It's kind of this idle mode, but it's definitely not doing nothing. There's a lot of self-reflection that happens there, understanding of others' perspectives, autobiographical memory, imagination, and this is always kind of going on all of the time.
And what happens with this 5-H2A receptor is that the psychedelic, it makes the receptor activation, the neurons, hyper-excitable. It activates these networks and it makes the brain more sensitive to inputs. So if psychedelics are making the brain more sensitive to inputs and much more easy to activate in certain central parts of our brain that are related to our thinking, perception, and that could relate to these experiences in the amplification of consciousness that one could experience under psychedelics. And with this increased activity of neuroplasticity, the brain wants to encode connections that are activated strongly, and it wants to make these connections last. Neuroplasticity gets upregulated through the use of these psychedelics. And our brain, these cells, these neurons, after psychedelics, they become significantly more complex. More resources equals more connections.
That just made me think of something really interesting too, Jen, as you were talking about how we have more neural connections and with more neuroplasticity, that it does require more resources too. So I think that's an important thing to think about as well. Like, how resourced am I going into this experience, metabolically, energetically, because this is going to use a lot of fuel at a really physiological level. There's going to be high demand of my system in this experience.
That's right. That's right. And so I think, this is something that we said we would get back to from that integration conversation. So I'm just going to take a moment to explain, how do psychedelics boost neuroplasticity, right? Because number one, the ability for neurons to rewire their connections or change existing ones, right? That is about gaining new knowledge, having new experiences, learning a new skill. And you hear us talk a lot about the SAID principle on this podcast. What we do, we get better at. And neuroplasticity is essential for behavior change. And when we're talking about the anatomy of a cell, their axons, dendrites, and synapse, we really want to focus a little bit now on dendrites, right? Because I've heard this explained a couple of different ways. Dendrites kind of look like tree branches. I've also heard one of my teachers, Manesh Gurn, talk about them as like an airport terminal, right? The more connections an airport terminal has, the more options there are for a flight out, right? So we want to increase these dendrites in particular in our cells. And so psychedelic induced changes in dendrites aren't the same everywhere in the brain. They occur most in regions that have the most serotonin 2A receptors. The medial prefrontal cortex, right? The executive functioning part of our brain, the qualities that make us human, help us problem solve, plan for the future, pay attention, regulate our emotions, and integrate our emotions with our thinking, right? So this increase of complexity in the dendrites in the MPFC is associated to less depressive behavior. And that's a big reason that people are often called to this type of psychedelic experience is for their mental health. But we know that in the MPFC, dendrites that undergo chronic stress and show depressive-like symptoms are regularly atrophied. Neurons in this state are less complex. They move to an atrophied state because they basically become shriveled up, and then they have less connections with other neurons, in turn translating to impaired function Versus with psychedelic therapy, there's an increase in healthy neurons and pathways to support regulating emotions and escaping negative thought patterns and depression.
This is really bringing up something interesting for me, but before, I just want to remind people, when we say PFC, we're talking about your prefrontal cortex. So when we say MPFC, we're talking about part of your prefrontal cortex, just so people can kind of orient to that we're talking about parts of our brain that are our higher order thinking systems. But as you were talking about the dendrites and the airport connections, I've been doing a lot of research and reading on theory of constructed emotions, Lisa Feldman Barrett, and that theory is pretty new and emerging in neuroscience, and it's really moving us away from the triune brain model where, we have a distinct emotional center, but rather looking at the emotional experience as a network, a patterned network that is constructed based on our past experiences and our interoceptive signals and our external environment, right? And so that's always happening in real time. It's our brain's interpretation of all of that, creating these patterns. We talk about neurotags on here a lot. And so really thinking of emotional experiences as those neurotags, and Barrett talks about the construction of emotions as happening in all regions of your brain, like an airport with many different hubs connecting. And so I was thinking, as we increase that connectivity in the airport between all of these hubs, it's really allowing for some repatterning of some of those well-worn paths of emotional construction. And because those are based so much on our past experience or cultural context, now we're kind of in this space where we have the opportunity to create a new emotional experience through different connections. And then we can take that new way of constructing the emotion out into the world after a somatic experience.
Yeah, it's really fascinating the way that psychedelics works, because they do have this apparent ability to amplify and bring forward aspects of our mind and ourselves that can be usually not accessible, repressed even, and bring things up from the depths. And this is why, when we talk about NSI being so supportive, for me, it's like the micro to the macro, because the brain, we do NSI so that we can integrate the aspects of our brain. And then it makes peak somatic experiences of any kind more digestible.
Yeah, absolutely. And especially all parts of it, right? The spiritual components, the emotional components. But let's talk a little bit about the emotional processing component of these peak somatic experiences, because I think that's what a lot of people are thinking of and seeking through some of these experiences.
I think so too. And broadly speaking, an emotional breakthrough is a feeling like you move through something, internal emotional conflict or trauma, to find a resolution to it, right? Coming to terms with emotions that have been repressed or avoided, or maybe you can process them in new ways, feeling the new resolution. And emotional releases are followed usually by giant senses of relief. Mm-hmm. It's one of the ways that therapeutic psychedelic experiences are actually measured. They have an altered states of consciousness questionnaire in the studies, and it's usually mystical, emotional, and psychological. But as we believe on this podcast, there's also a somatic experience that is not often measured through the psychedelic experience.
Yes, and I think I want to just kind of frame some of this by going back to this idea that from an NSI perspective, when we're talking about a somatic experience, it's not necessarily just a big catharsis where you purge all your trauma and then you're healed, right? You've just got it out of your body. It doesn't really work that way, right? Mm-hmm. We don't just purge a pattern from the brain and the nervous system and then the imprint of that traumatic experience is gone. What actually happens is that the pattern is being brought to the surface, right? The whole neurotag that we just talked about, that includes your emotional responses, your physiological reactions, your somatic experiences, and even sometimes those cognitive fragments, And then you're in this neuroplastic state and you're given the chance to re-experience the pattern in a new way where you have different cognitive thoughts or more self-awareness or even new truths about your identity, as it might have been shaped by some of those traumatic experiences. You might feel compassion for yourself or others, or just get a different, broader perspective. And the beauty of that process is that then you have the ability to actually process those physical sensations and emotions through maybe movement or vocalization or crying or shaking or purging if that's what your system needs. But we're not just purging it one and done. It's not something that has to be like extricated from our body. It's about having the new experience of emotional processing, teaching our system that that's possible, and then taking that into our life. It's a little shift in the pattern, a new rep. And that's where integration and preparation become really important, because we can, I think, sometimes get into that cycle of like, we're just chasing the next big release and getting kind of addicted to that sense of catharsis and the hormonal cascade of feel-good chemicals. But if you're just kind of hopping from one intense release to the next intense release, then you end up right back where you started without really creating that meaningful change. And when you have these powerful neuroplastic experiences where your nervous system is open to new ways of being, you still have to keep working with the pattern, the new awareness, and process it in daily life in that minimum effective dose way to create real change through a new relationship with the traumatic imprint that then gradually transforms your system's ability to process and move emotions.
We're going to talk about preparation and integration here in a little bit, but I would just argue to say the psychedelic experience is not the hardest part of the experience. It's what you do afterwards with it. And I just want to add some caution here to this part of the conversation. As I said in the intro, like, I am not someone who, even though I live in this work, for me, psychedelic therapy has been incredibly potent and powerful for my behavior change and my life. And also, they are not for every nervous system. And in fact, I think that the messaging of the psychedelic renaissance and freight train that's moving towards us right now is dangerous. It is not trauma informed, and it has real implications for someone who has complex trauma. There are risks for individuals with a history of complex trauma, psychosis, and even dissociation. And so, like we talked about, there is a potential for a lot of resurfacing to come, and it comes in a very destabilizing way. If we are not prepared for that in our bodies, it is going to be incredibly disruptive. This is where we talk about set and setting, right? The set is your preparation for this, and the importance of guided experiences with trauma-informed practitioners. This is where your discernment is going to come in to find this trauma-informed practitioner, because the psychedelic experience, even I think the somatic breathwork experience, like the peak somatic experience realm at large is not trauma-informed. And like I said, I find it dangerous.
It is. I mean, we have seen so many clients that come to us after a peak somatic experience that are in a very dangerous place, very dysregulated, having big dissociative responses or breaches with reality or depressive episodes, suicidal ideation. So these things, they do happen in this space. And there are many tools available for people that don't have to be in a psychedelic experience, right? Like we can move at a much slower pace. We could do EFT, we could use NSI tools, we could do gradual somatic processing, and in a more sustainable way that matches more with our nervous system's capacity, start to create that change, to still have that emotional processing skill, to still come to those new embodied experiences. And that, that capacity building work isn't like the glamorous stuff that you see out there. Like you were saying, Jen, like it's the continuous integration of the experiences afterwards and the preparation before, so that we're expanding our nervous system's resilience, and we're not just reinforcing that cycle of like big dysregulation and then back into the big protective outputs. And then we go into another experience and have big dysregulation and feel like it's catharsis, but actually it's leaving us really depleted. And then we just keep reinforcing that without taking the time to build capacity and to integrate what we're experiencing.
That's right. And I think let's talk about a somatic experience and what that means, why it's so challenging. And I just want to refer you now, we had a conversation a few months back about memory, somatic memory particularly. And so I really encourage and invite you all to explore that conversation, because a traumatic memory without a cognitive memory attached is one that is stored primarily in the body and the nervous system rather than an explicit conscious memory system, right? This type of memory is known as an implicit memory or a somatic memory, and often shows up as sensations, emotions, psychological responses, or reflexive behaviors that are not linked to a clear verbalized narrative. Right. So in this instance, the brain, the amygdala, and implicit memory systems are responding to the sensory trigger without the involvement of conscious recall. This is because the traumatic memory was not stored in a coherent narrative, just like the somatic and emotional markers of the experience.
Yeah, we talked a lot about that in our memory episode, like you said, and we shared that we have had some experiences where we're having the experience in a purely somatic way. I'm reliving the sensations and the knowings that are attached to those sensations, but there is no clear memory. And that can be quite disorienting, and it can be hard to trust that. And so it took a lot of building a relationship with my body, a lot of interoceptive training to hear those signals, to interpret them with accuracy, to understand what a somatic yes and no is for me, so that I had that relationship of trust with my body and it wasn't completely overwhelming when I had that experience.
Yeah, I mean, I think people often associate psychedelics with having visual imagery, right? Alterations in visual fields and maybe even vivid visuals behind the eyes. And that is not the case of what I've experienced with the lot of women that I work with who have a high A score, who have chronic trauma, right? There's a high chance that you're going to feel it in the body versus having the visual cortex stimulated. When we're talking about that serotonin receptor being so much in the visual field, it's very interesting to think about the science of why this would be happening when the receptor is in the eyes and the person is not experiencing that. And that is it's very jarring. The first time I had a somatic journey, I was just like, what is going on? Because my years I spent having visual experiences. And then the one time it came through, I was just like, it was scary.
Yeah, it really can be. I want to touch a little bit on why some memories might be more somatic. So we want to remember our hippocampus is responsible for forming explicit declarative memories, like narrative memories that we can consciously recall. And during a traumatic event, our hippocampus can be impaired, right? We have high levels of stress hormones that can impair hippocampal function. The stress response is too intense. And so as a result, the experience isn't encoded as a coherent narrative, and that can lead to fragmented or absent cognitive memory. It can also have to do with our age, right? If it happened at a very early age, we don't even have the proteins to lay down long-term memory. And so there's just the imprint of the nervous system response, but not a cognitive memory. We can have amygdala hyperactivity during a traumatic experience. So there's a strong emotional or survival response. And then that response, that reaction of our nervous system, the interpretation of those sensory cues, what they mean, the simulation and the how those sensory cues are categorized, the meaning that we make of them, changes. And it's that imprint, it's the interpretation of the sensory cues without a cohesive narrative that's really retained. And so then we have more of like a sensory imprint without conscious recall. We can also have a response from the periaqueductal gray and a freeze response where we have immobility triggered and we're in kind of a freeze state in the event. And that can lead us into repression of movement and dissociation from the body. And so we never have developed the skills of mobilizing and processing those events. And we really have much more implicit memory storage, right? The brain is storing these experiences through the implicit memory system, the basal ganglia, the cerebellum, that encode more procedural and sensory motor information, right? So our emotional and bodily responses are getting kind of encoded in there without a timestamp. And then they can be activated by similar sensory cues in the future without conscious awareness of why.
And this can be like, let's talk about why some of these peak somatic experiences can be difficult for people with chronic dissociation, right? For someone who has chronic dissociation, there's a reduced interoceptive awareness. The nervous system is not used to feeling sensations fully. There is an overwhelming embodiment, right? Without the cognitive filter, the body may be flooded with sensations and emotions. There's safety challenges there. For someone with a history of dissociation, somatic experiences can feel destabilizing, or they don't have the capacity not to continue to move into repressive responses either during or after the experience. And then there's the potential triggers that arise, right? If the body feels too much too quickly, it can create a backlash effect, increasing dissociation or triggering that freeze response. And so one thing I want to say is, like, even when we're talking about the classic psychedelics that we mentioned earlier, like psilocybin is a very embodying spirit. Something like a 5-MeO DMT, that's going to blast you off totally out of your body. So that could actually perpetuate the chronic dissociation and the freeze response. And then, like, you've got to come back into the body, which is going to create a big amount of threat. And then you have, the embodied psilocybin medicine, where if someone is chronically dissociated, they start to feel all of this, you're just going to dissociate through the experience and you will not receive the benefits of the psychedelic medicine or of whatever the peak somatic experience is. And so there's a real importance here of slow, gradual, and intentional re-embodiment practices for those of us with complex trauma. It's important to work in our bodies first to know how to receive these sensations and feelings. What is it like to receive a memory from the body when we're not under an altered state of consciousness?
Yes, I think there's so many good points there. Like, these different medicines, these different modalities affect us differently, right? It could take us out of our body, it could bring us in. So really understanding what you're working with, and then understanding how that's going to affect your unique nervous system based on your history, and just kind of circling back to this idea that, we're not just quote unquote releasing trauma from the body. And we talked about that. I think it was in an episode that we did with Matt on questions about NSI, that it's a little bit of a misunderstanding to think like the trauma lives in the tissue, and that what's actually happening is it's this interplay between the body and the brain in a continuous loop, right? We're really working with whole neural networks that are associated with a traumatic event. And we have these neurotags that include emotional, physiological, somatic, and cognitive components. And when we engage in somatic processing, it's not just about letting something go. It's really about repatterning how the nervous system responds to those interoceptive inputs, to those sensory signals from our body, and how that shapes our neural networks, our patterns and our predictions, and then the output that we experience. And so talking about dissociation and like, are we moving into that well-worn path, or are we starting to repattern how we respond to those interoceptive signals when they're amplified? And do we have the capacity to reshape that response?
There can be a concern too that someone is scared of a challenging experience, right? A quote, bad trip. And if you prepare your nervous system properly, that is not likely. And a challenging experience doesn't also mean a bad experience, but that's where our set and setting, our support comes into play. And like, if you're going into an experience where you are apprehensive, you're confused, or in any state of distress, this is not the time to be altering your state of consciousness and inducing states where that you cannot actually manage or have the capacity for. And so like these nervous system factors, they should not be ignored. And once again, this is why we work with our unique nervous systems.
Yeah. There's such an element in these experiences of releasing control. And that can be really challenging for people. And so some preparation around working with some of that and processing the stress of that, because like you said, just because an experience is uncomfortable or challenging doesn't mean that it's bad, but we do have to have the ability to release some of that resistance in the experience, to open our hands, to relax our body, to say, teach me, to be curious, to learn. If we're continuously fighting and moving into a stress response, that's going to create a very difficult situation.
Yeah, let's talk about the importance of preparation, because the idea of preparation is about building a foundation of nervous system regulation tools before attempting the peak somatic experience. So maybe we want to enhance interoceptive awareness and capacity for emotional processing. It might even be about, I have a high interoceptive awareness, right? So it's not about high or low. It's about accuracy here. Like that is what we're always going towards when we're talking about inputs to the brain and the way that we are receiving sensations and feelings through the body. So we prepare the nervous system for the potential dysregulation during a peak somatic experience, right? Like, if you're someone who experiences chronic dissociation, I would not recommend a peak somatic experience like this. It could really push you over the edge. And then we have integration, right? What do we do after the experience? This is equally critical for healing. In fact, this can be some of the biggest work, because I was with someone several years ago in an experience, an older lady. She was in her 70s, chronically dissociated and disembodied. And after she received the medicine, if you love Trauma Rewired, you've heard us talk about the tools that create real lasting change in the nervous system. Tools that help rewire deep-seated stress responses, emotional patterns, and survival strategies. But here's the thing, healing isn't a one-size-fits-all. Inside rewiretrial.com, you don't just learn about the tools, we guide you through applying them in a strategic, personalized way that meets your unique nervous system where it is. Learn the exact neurosomatic tools we reference on the podcast, from vagus nerve drills to emotional processing techniques. Customize your practice to your own nervous system and pace, so you see continued sustainable progress. Experience expert guidance and real-time support inside our live daily classes and interactive community. This is where you take the knowledge from the podcast and turn it into real embodied transformation. Start your 2 free-week trial now and start rewiring for resilience at rewiretrial.com. After she received the medicine, she couldn't feel the experience. She couldn't feel it. And it left her very disappointed afterwards. So when we think about what we do, we get better at, and what's critical afterwards, she couldn't get there because she didn't think it worked for her. Right. And so like that's dangerous. What we do, we get better at. So she actually left her experience feeling bad. That's not ideal for the conversation that we had about neuroplasticity a few minutes ago. Right.
Yeah. And it really brings back this idea of capacity and the preparation too, because even taking a really large dose of the medicine and like trying to blast through that internal resistance, her system was not resourced and had not developed that skill of not moving into repression and feeling those sensations. So sometimes you can't even override it with a large dose. And would you want to? Like, would that be safe, you know? And so I think also too, kind of circling back to the beginning, and fueling and capacity and spending some time making sure that we have a nervous system that is functioning well and that we're resourced to be able to handle this experience. And then that we have trained, for lack of a better word, our interoceptive skill, being able to feel and also interpret with accuracy. Like you were saying, it's not just about feeling, because sometimes we feel a lot, but about what meaning do we give those signals and what response does that create in our body? And can we work with that gradually over time to make emotional processing possible and safer for these experiences?
That's right, because NSI tools help us to reinforce neuroplastic changes and new emotional patterns. And any psychedelic study that you read, there is always someone who does not improve from the experience. Always. Because what we do, we get better at. And if you are not engaging in grounding techniques, emotional processing, regulation practices, and this is an ongoing regulation, right? It's important to understand that our nervous systems are fluid, right? And we're not looking for that straight line. We're looking for being able to upregulate when we need to, downregulate when we need to. And with NSI, we assess, we reassess, we track our progress, we make adjustments to tools. And how we integrate, it really helps the nervous system retain the insights to create lasting change. Because you could have the most mind-blowing experience of your life, and your brain patterning, it will go to what it knows beyond anything.
Yeah, I want to get a little bit personal here, because as you were talking about assessment and reassessment, I was thinking just the process of using tools, assessing and reassessing is so important, because you're really learning to speak the language of your nervous system. You're really developing that relationship with your body. And that's part of how we build trust and get to know ourselves at that deep level. And then we're also identifying where are our unique deficits, where are the things that I need to work on. Because when I have done some psychedelic experiences. I think we talked about that in integration. But when I first started, I had done some neurotraining, but until I really started developing NSI and really moving into this world of neurosomatics for trauma resolution, I focused mostly on movement, athletic performance, working with my visual system. There wasn't a lot of interoceptive training. And that's where a lot of my deep deficits were. And I had not gone down that path of rehabilitation. And so the first time I went into some peak somatic experiences for healing, I will say it was very jarring for me. And I also followed it, the period following, there wasn't any talk about integration or any of that with the facility that I was working with. And I found myself back very deeply in my protective outputs. My binging was really bad. I was having a lot of body pain. My dissociation was worse, and I didn't understand it. And I hadn't known before that how to work with my unique nervous system and my unique deficits. And then, as you and I have been on a long healing journey together and working more on this, I've had very different experiences, but I've had to put the time in where my body needed support and rehabilitation.
That's right. Because we're all unique going into these experiences. And, there is a huge potential to heal and to grow in these peak somatic experiences versus the pharmaceutical model where typical psychiatric drugs work by changing your brain chemistry and activating receptors to regulate your mood and symptoms, but you're not having a life-altering experience and able to rescue significant outputs like depression-related outputs. And so one thing with NSI, which I find particularly fascinating, most psychedelic studies, whether they are studying psilocybin, ibogaine, 5-MeO, all the microdose to the macrodose, they don't measure experiences ever lasting past 6-8 months. Whereas I've been integrating NSI and peak somatic experiences for 5 years. And both of us are experiencing lasting effects from our experiences because we understand how to prepare, how to integrate. And then we also have support as we move through this.
The support, I'm really glad you just brought that up too, is really key, because we're going often from these experiences back into our life in the exact same way that it was before, the same relationships, the same environment, and bringing these new awarenesses and these changes in our identity and our emotional experience. It can be challenging, and it can be challenging because of the relationships around us too. And so having, like, again, just really stressing having a practitioner to work with that you trust and support and have built a relationship with prior to the experience, to give you that relational support as well, to be a pattern for how to bring these changes into your other relationships, is just so vital. Having a community that is on the same page and understanding, it's just like, it's really, really important, because a lot of the repatterning and the changes come in our relationships.
That's right. That's right. And I also too want to mention minimum effective dose, because the ego comes into these psychedelic spaces where there's like a hero's dose and people think they have to do that. You do not have to do that. What is appropriate for one body might not be appropriate for yours, and you don't need to go off and blast yourself wide open. That might not be therapeutic. Yeah. And it's hard to measure neuroplasticity and a therapeutic experience in like a human concrete way, right? And so like, that's another reason why you want to work with someone who is trauma informed and understands these nuances of a nervous system, can reflect your nervous system back to you also.
As you were talking, it's like, I really get it. I get, like, someone's looking for relief, somebody wants to dive full in. And sometimes that works for some people, but I just really urge people considering this to do research, find practitioners, because we've just seen a lot of times the ways that it can go sideways. And I know that we can really want these experiences for ourselves. And we also have to have compassion for our nervous system, especially if we have CPTS, and know that there's so much patterning underneath there, that we want to honor our own capacity and really make sure we're moving in the direction that we want with our healing practices, so that we aren't re-traumatizing ourselves.
That's right, because those latent aspects of ourselves, they can be equally inspiring or earth-shattering, right? And that revelation is going to affect your nervous system. When psychedelics became part of like the mainstream, and like during the 60s, the Vietnam War protests, there was unity, right? There was a more collective effort in the realm of psychedelics, right? And now psychedelics can be used as like this internal solo experience. What does it do for me? And I really want to invite you to like, what will this do for the collective? How can we use this experience not just for our own internal shifts? Like, these used to be medicines where we came together, right? We wanted change in this country. We wanted change for everybody, not just what is it for me? And I think that's really important to bring back, that we have a collective responsibility to each other, whether you like it or not. Healing is relational. And so I just invite you to look a little bit broader and feel into the broader sense of what these medicines and what these experiences can do for you and the world around us, the people around us.
That's a beautiful thought. I love that. I love that invitation.